Thank you for that, Kevin. And it is a pleasure to be here today, even though it's historically a very confusing moment. And I'm not so sure that I can shed much light or much more optimism on our conversation, given the comments that have been made before. I want to start by saying that The Economist magazine this week had a title or asked a question: is the post-1945 world order dead, and what might emerge to replace it? This is a question that many people are asking, and I think each day, as previous speakers have highlighted, brings some new and very confusing, I have to say, headlines. I limit myself to about 15 minutes a day of Trump world, because it's all I can take. Let me start by saying that my title, Peace in Pieces, has two quite different meanings, intentionally. The negative one is that the global hopes for peace are shattered, like a teacup broken into pieces, falling on the floor. Peace is in pieces. The less negative one, perhaps not totally optimistic, but at least a little bit, is that if we want to rebuild towards a more peaceful world order, and we're far from that today, we need to do so piece by piece. And I'll say a few words about that later, but starting with some very small steps and a long-term plan, and a realistic assessment of the strengths of the forces that are leading us to some very dark scenarios of war, violence, disorder, exclusion, and inequality. So we have to focus on building peace, one piece at a time, and I'll return to that in a couple of minutes. I want, in the next few minutes, to try and get just a little bit beyond the headlines, not to talk about Trump, although I'm happy to answer questions about current developments, but reflect on how we got here with a bit of a longer-term perspective on a few of the contemporary events. The highlights are quite depressing. We know from Kevin's presentation that the number of violent armed conflicts is at a level not seen since 1945. There are more than 55 ongoing armed conflicts, large and small, all corners of the world. This is higher than even at the last stages of the Cold War. It's not a particular coincidence that the number of conflicts has been growing or new ones have erupted. For example, the Tutsi-backed militia group in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, with the direct backing of Rwanda, is taking over major cities from the Congolese army. And Rwandan President Paul Kagame last week at least denied that his troops were involved, which is, of course, part of a strategy. And this occurs in a context of complete impunity. Everyone knows that the international community, or the UN, or any other organization, is unable or unwilling to act. And there will be more violent actors who take advantage of this particular vacuum. The escalation in armed conflict has led to a dramatic increase in deaths in conflict, extremely high levels of forced displacement. From 2004 to 2006, which was the low point, that is to say, of deaths, so the optimistic point, there was about 27,000 people who died in armed conflicts per year. That figure has gone up more than 8 times, and deaths from interstate conflict exceeded 250,000 in 2021 and 2022. The global level of forced displacement has more than doubled, with more than 117 million people forced to flee their homes, which fuels not only a refugee crisis, but also some very intense debates around migration. And as we know, global military spending, as Kevin pointed out, is at an all-time high. Last December, Japan approved a 9.4% increase in its defense budget, which is the 11th year in a row in which Japanese military spending has continued. And the government, in justifying this, said that it's needed in order to meet the most severe and complex security environment since the end of World War II. And Japan is a leading example, but not the only one, of this turn towards greater self-reliance. And I'll say a bit more about that, too. The list of other difficult situations beyond violent conflict is long. Rising authoritarianism, weakening democratic institutions, greater political polarization, and these points have been touched on by my colleagues. And they all fuel the global crisis of political legitimacy. So how did we arrive here? And what are some of the implications? I'm going to talk very briefly about two things. The first is the current and future state of the global peace and security architecture. And then the second is something that's just been touched upon briefly, which is what is the political economy or the economic underpinnings of this. No more facts and figures, though, I hope. Historically, after every major war and crisis, diplomats and leaders created some form of architecture to maintain peace and security. The first of these, as those of you who've done a little bit of international history will know, emerges in the 18th and 19th century and was the so-called balance of power, explicitly enshrined in treaties after the Spanish Succession War, after the Napoleonic Wars. And its main objective, probably its only objective, was to minimize the risk of major war between great powers and maintain the stability of the interstate system. It did not necessarily maintain the peace. It did not protect the interests of smaller states and powers that were often sacrificed through invasion or territorial dismemberment. It certainly did not protect the peoples within any of these states. And the story that we tell of the subsequent centuries is of the progressive development in the 19th and 20th centuries, moving beyond this crude global security architecture to manage relations between great powers through institutions, through diplomatic and more peaceful means, beginning with the Concert of Europe, moving through formal institutions such as the League of Nations, and of course, the United Nations. These all reflected several underlying ideas, one of which was how relations between states should be regulated, but another is what forms of domestic government are considered legitimate. Sometimes anything goes. More recently, democratic states were privileged. What kind of rights, if any, citizens had, and how the world economy should be managed. And these were interlinked. And I want to highlight that politics, economic, society, human rights, and global security are part of one package. They're not separate spheres. Now, we describe the post-45 world, or at least the post-Cold War world, as a liberal American-led world order, and in particular recently with a robust set of peace operations, post-conflict peace building, based on promotion of human rights, a willingness to intervene to protect the lives of civilians, and an emphasis on mediation and conflict resolution. All of this is off the table or disappearing very rapidly. We should, though, recognize that this 30-year period between roughly 1991 and today was, in a certain sense, a golden age, a very short-lived one, and perhaps a bit unique historically. It also, at least throughout the Cold War, before that, did not cover all parts of the world. So it takes a bit of historical amnesia to think that we have been living in a very peaceful world order for a very long time. In fact, prior to 1991, there were major wars throughout Africa, Southeast Asia, elsewhere that took millions and millions of lives. The reality of that was that there was a whole lot of violence, coercion, rule breaking by major powers, and the exclusion of whole swaths of the world's population from the benefits of the so-called cold or long peace. So we may be moving back, but we're not moving to somewhere that we haven't been before. And I think we need to recognize that. We may be witnessing a return to a situation of naked geopolitics where only the interests of great powers matter, to echo Thucydides, where the strong do what they wish and the weak endure what they must. And the only thing that the global peace architecture will do moving forward is reduce the risk of major war between Russia, China, the US, and any other state that can make a claim to being a great power, as Japan did in 1905 when it was admitted to the Club of Great Powers, and may once again, or any state that proliferates weapons, nuclear or conventional. And we may have minimalist measures for risk reduction, reassurance, and stabilization, because we've abandoned pretty much the entire dense network of arms control agreements and stabilization measures that governed the Cold War period. So this is actually a very bleak picture, but again, it's not a new picture, and I think we can draw some lessons from that. Second thing I want to spend the last 4 or 5 minutes on is talking about one other aspect of the liberal order that has only been mentioned very briefly by Olivia and a couple of others, which was the stable framework for tremendous economic growth and increases in well-being that was put in place after 1945. Part of the Japanese economic miracle from until the mid-1970s, part of what the French called les 30 glorieuses, the 30 glorious years. And this took place, again, against the backdrop of American political and economic hegemony and governance of the world economy. I want to underline that the peace and security architecture is not separate from the global economy. And what has happened in the last 3 or 4 decades has been a radical undermining of some of the sources of distribution, regulation, and wealth through neoliberal economic globalization. It can be dated to the period of the 1980s. There have been tremendous gains for the very rich, but the bottom 90% of the world has 15% of the world's wealth, and the top 10% have 85% of it. And globalization over the past 3 decades has destroyed the balance within states, between economic interest, states, and society. Hyperglobalization, as some people have called it, is undermining democracy. It's not an accident that people have no faith in democracy, because it isn't delivering the goods, which is not just about representing your voice on a particular issue you care about, but so-called bread and butter issues. And this is something that has fueled the populist rise in many countries, not just the United States. I could go on with the examples. They range from the wastelands in parts of northern Britain, some disenfranchised parts of eastern Germany and elsewhere. But I think we can argue, or at least we can note, that the economic issues are not just a domestic social and economic problem within particular states, because they undermine support for broader global efforts to promote peace and security, and they call into question any support for globalization to continue. It's created a polarized world of winners and losers, and it has political consequences. So and this is a very long story that I made very short, but if we put it in this longer historical perspective, we can see this isn't about 1 or 2 leaders or 1 or 2 elections or Donald Trump, but what are the forces that gave rise to leaders like him and make them popular? He was voted into office. So to return to my question, what are the building blocks that we can use to reconstruct in the long run a more peaceful global, regional, national, and local world in the face of this crisis? I want to just return for 1 minute to the metaphor. Architects can design beautiful buildings and bridges and projects. Engineers are in charge of seeing what's realistic, keeping in line with the laws of physics and the properties of building materials. But the real heroes are the builders, the people who actually, brick by brick or beam by beam, build the bridges and houses and so forth. Rebuilding requires the efforts of builders, not just architects. And I think I want to take that metaphor seriously to say that we need to start very locally, in a certain sense, encouraging deglobalization, if you will. Not that that's not in the way that Donald Trump means it, but in at least promoting and refocusing attention on national and local contexts where people can build safer lives and resilient communities and capture some of the wealth that is being created and captured by global corporations, not just the big GAFAs or whatever they are, but the huge multinationals that are shifting profits and avoiding taxes around the world, and getting back some of the closer relations between state and society and the economy. We need also to build from the bottom up, supporting local peace-building initiatives within cities and communities. In the current context, this means local civil society organizations, faith-based organizations, grassroots, and subnational or regional initiatives that bring these groups together in coalitions, which must be greater than the sum of each of their individual issues. It's clear that one of the failures of the Democratic Party was to build a coalition that actually saw beyond the individual interests of any particular group that supported them, because as soon as the position of Kamala Harris deviated from what their interest was, they would say, I will not vote for her. And this is actually a crucial factor undermining democratic practice. So we need to build coalitions and alliances, and we need to be opportunistic. Cannot escape the chaos and the disorder that Kevin and others have traced, but we also can't afford to give up and retreat into political passivity. My conclusion is that if we turn our attention to the builders, turn very local, and become builders ourselves, not architects, not even maybe engineers, but that's where we can find and support and take advantage of the opportunities around the world that are not gaining great attention now, but that will help build, at least in some small way, pools of peace and peace in pieces. And hopefully we can build upwards from that. Thank you.